I never imagined that moving to a quiet neighborhood would turn into the most stressful chapter of my life. The kind of story that feels like it belongs in someone else's life. Not mine. But it started the day I first laid eyes on the lake behind my new home. A mirror of glass reflecting the early morning sun and the promise of peaceful days I had been craving for years. I had moved from the city to escape noise, deadlines, and neighbors who never smiled, seeking a place where I could breathe freely and finally feel like I belonged, and the lake seemed to offer that in abundance, stretching wide enough to cast gentle ripples across the surface when the wind blew, its edges lined with reeds and water lilies, a perfect sanctuary for fishing, reflection, and solitude, the kind of private luxury that made me feel like I had finally earned something just for myself. And I spent the first few weeks walking the perimeter, learning the shallow spots, the deep pools where bass like to hide, the quiet corners where the light hit the water in golden shafts that made me think the world could be as calm as this every day if only I could hold on to it. My neighbors at first seemed friendly, nodding politely when I waved, exchanging small talk at the mailbox or during the occasional walk through the community trails. I was careful to follow all the HOA rules, paying my fees on time, keeping my lawn immaculate, never leaving anything outside that wasn't permitted, because I had heard the stories of people who clashed with them and wanted to avoid becoming one of those cautionary tales. The HOA had a reputation for strict enforcement, but I had assumed it was harmless bureaucracy, a price to pay for living in a well-maintained neighborhood. Everything seemed peaceful and perfect until the first hint that something was wrong appeared one morning when I walked to the dock to find the fish floating strangely near the surface, their movements sluggish, the water smelling faintly chemical, almost metallic, and a shiver ran down my spine because I had fished this lake every morning and had never seen anything like it. I called the HOA office, expecting concern or at least an explanation, and the woman who answered sounded rehearsed, dismissing my worry with a casual, almost annoyed tone, saying the lake had just been treated with routine chemicals, everything was fine, but the words felt hollow and made my stomach twist with unease. I had a growing sense that someone was hiding something, but I didn't yet understand the depth of it. The next day I noticed the reeds near the shore had begun to look sickly, brown tips curling over. A few ducks I often saw gliding peacefully across the water were absent, and the tranquility I had loved was starting to feel like a fragile illusion. I mentioned it to a neighbor, hoping for some reassurance, and was met with a shrug and a quick change of subject, as if acknowledging the problem was forbidden. And in that moment I realized I wasn't just facing a problem with the lake, but with the community itself, an invisible tension hanging in the air that nobody wanted to talk about. Over the next week, my mornings on the dock grew tense, the wind whipping at the water no longer comforting but sharp and accusatory. The fish seemed fewer, the water darker, and the quiet that had once felt like a gift now felt oppressive. I began noticing small signs that didn't make sense. Fences being checked and repaired at odd hours, maintenance trucks arriving with chemicals in unmarked containers, and neighbors glancing at me with what felt like suspicion. I couldn't tell if it was paranoia or if something truly sinister was happening. One evening I tried speaking to the HOA president in person, a tall, precise woman with sharp eyes who everyone whispered about but never challenged. Her office smelled of polished wood and faint disinfectant, and she smiled at me politely, but her smile didn't reach her eyes as I asked about the state of the lake. She said it was part of routine maintenance and that I shouldn't worry, but the flicker in her expression and the way her fingers tightened around the pen on her desk made me uneasy. It was the kind of moment where you know someone is hiding more than they should. I left her office feeling a mixture of frustration and fear, walking past the manicured lawns, the quiet streets, the perfectly lined houses, all appearing serene and ordinary. Yet I felt a tension under the surface, an invisible web of rules, control, and perhaps even malice. I went home and sat on my dock until the sun dipped low, watching the water reflect pink and orange hues, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining the danger. But the dead leaves floating on the surface, the absence of birds, the odd smell of chemicals, all whispered that something was very wrong. And deep down I knew this wasn't a small mistake or oversight, it was deliberate, and though I didn't yet know why, I sensed that the life I had dreamed of in this neighborhood was about to collide with a reality I could never have predicted. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, I made a silent promise to myself that I would uncover the truth, no matter what it took, because this lake, this sanctuary I had fallen in love with, was more than water and fish. It was my life, my peace, and someone was threatening to destroy it. The next morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach, the kind of unease that settles deep in your chest when you know something is about to go very wrong. And I headed down to the lake as usual, hoping the water would offer some reassurance. But the moment I stepped onto the dock, my heart sank. The surface was even darker than the day before, a faint oily sheen glimmering in the sunlight, and the fish that had once leapt and splashed were nowhere to be seen. Instead, a few lifeless bodies floated listlessly, and the smell of chemicals was stronger, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I knew then that the HOA had not only dismissed the problem, they had worsened it, and panic clawed at me because I didn't know how far it had spread or who might be affected. I rushed inside to call the HOA, determined to speak to the president again. But before I could reach her, a man I had never seen before appeared at my door, wearing a uniform that looked official but left me uneasy. He claimed to be a water inspector sent by the HOA to check the lake, and while he smiled politely, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation that made my skin prickle as he tested the water and took notes. He glanced at me and said, "You probably shouldn't worry, ma'am. Everything is under control." But his tone carried a coldness that contradicted his words, and I realized that these reassurances were empty, perhaps intentionally so, and that someone was manipulating the truth to keep me compliant. I tried to ask him about the chemicals, the dead fish, the smell, but he deflected every question, repeating the same phrases, insisting that the water was safe, and when I pressed further, he simply packed his equipment and left, leaving me alone with my fear and the increasingly suspicious eyes of my neighbors, who seemed to be watching me from behind curtains or over hedges. Their polite smiles now replaced with tight-lipped stares that made me feel like I had become a problem they didn't want to acknowledge. Over the next few days, I noticed other strange occurrences: maintenance crews arriving at odd hours, dumping barrels into the water and leaving before I could approach them, the once serene lake now a place of tension and quiet menace. And I began to see the community differently, the manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges masking a web of control and secrecy. I decided to speak to a longtime resident, an older man who often sat on his porch feeding birds, hoping he could shed some light on the situation, and at first he seemed reluctant, avoiding my questions and shaking his head, but eventually, his eyes softened and he whispered that the HOA had always been obsessed with power and appearances, that they controlled everything from the rules to the water itself, and I realized with a growing horror that the lake might be more than just a personal sanctuary, that it could be connected to something vital that I hadn't understood. My mind raced as I remembered the vague comment from the HOA president about routine maintenance, and how odd it had seemed at the time. Could it be that the lake was tied to the neighborhood's water supply, that their attempts to control it were more than petty rules, that they had underestimated the consequences, and suddenly the situation wasn't just about fishing or dead fish. It was about something far larger, about safety, control, and my ability to protect myself and everyone around me. I spent hours researching, combing through public records, HOA documents, anything that could give me a clue, and what I discovered was shocking, buried in technical language and obscure memos. Notes about the lake's water feeding into the community's main supply, references to treatment systems, pipelines, and dependence that no one had bothered to explain to residents, and it hit me like a punch to the chest. The very lake they were poisoning to prevent me from fishing was essential to everyone's water, and their actions could have put the entire neighborhood at risk. Anger and fear mingled inside me as I realized the depth of their recklessness. But before I could act, I noticed a change in the community itself. A quiet tension settling over neighbors, whispered conversations stopping when I approached, children no longer playing near the water, everyone moving cautiously, as if the lake had become a forbidden place, the once friendly environment now oppressive, and I felt the isolation settle heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't just facing the HO, I was facing a wall of complicity and fear. I began documenting everything, taking photographs, recording the smell and color of the water, noting times and dates of maintenance trucks, conversations, anything that could serve as proof, and as I did, I became more aware of the subtle ways the HOA controlled the neighborhood, from fines and rules to invisible threats, the feeling of being watched at all times, and the realization that they saw me as a threat because I refused to accept their control. Each day the lake grew more dangerous, the water darker, the chemical smell stronger, the few remaining fish barely moving, and my anxiety escalated into determination. I couldn't let them get away with this, not when everyone's water depended on it. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, and sleep became fitful and shallow, haunted by visions of poisoned water and neighbors drinking it unaware. I knew confrontation was inevitable, but I also understood that stepping forward alone could be dangerous. The HOA had power, influence, and authority, and they were already willing to bend rules to assert control. Yet I felt a strange clarity amidst the fear, a sense that I had no choice but to act, that exposing the truth and protecting the lake was not just about me anymore. It was about the safety and well-being of everyone living here. The rising tension in the community mirrored the turmoil inside me. Every glance from a neighbor, every unanswered question from the HOA, every dead fish on the lake's surface was a reminder that the calm I had sought when I moved here was a fragile illusion, and as I stared out over the water that evening, the orange sunset glinting off the dark ripples, I felt both dread and resolve, knowing that the coming days would force me into a confrontation that could change everything, and that whatever happened, I could no longer pretend that paradise had been returned to me. The lake and my life were entangled in a struggle I had never imagined, and I had to be ready for whatever consequences came next. I knew I couldn't wait any longer, that the time for caution had passed. So I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. The room was filled with polished smiles and murmured conversations. But as soon as I stepped in, I felt the weight of suspicion, every eye seeming to linger on me just a second too long. The president, the same woman whose smile never reached her eyes, sat at the front, flanked by two board members who radiated quiet authority. And when I asked to speak, the room went almost silent, a tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. I explained calmly but firmly the state of the lake, the dead fish, the chemical smell, the discoloration, and the way the community seemed to be in danger, hoping to appeal to reason. But her reaction stunned me, a sharp laugh, dismissive, cold, and cutting. "You are making assumptions without understanding how things work?" she said, leaning back in her chair, her gaze scanning the room as if daring anyone to contradict her. I felt my frustration spike, but I held it, refusing to let anger control me, and I pressed on, asking about the chemicals, the testing reports, and the documents I had uncovered that hinted at the lake's connection to the water supply. Her response was a practiced mix of condescension and avoidance. She said the lake's treatment was routine and necessary, that I should not spread fear, and that any further complaints could result in fines for harassment of board members, a threat that sent a cold chill through me. The whispers among the other residents were uncomfortable, some shifting nervously in their seats, avoiding eye contact, and I realized that I wasn't just up against rules, I was up against an entire system designed to silence dissent. A collective fear that had become compliance. As the meeting continued, the tension escalated. A younger board member, who I had previously seen smiling politely at neighbors, suddenly spoke in a low voice, implying that my questions were disruptive, unnecessary, that I was making trouble, and a knot of dread formed in my stomach because I recognized that this was personal, that the board wasn't just defending procedures, they were targeting me for pushing too far. The confrontation escalated as I demanded clarity, my voice rising slightly, and the president's smile vanished completely, replaced by a stare so sharp it felt like she could cut through me. She leaned forward and said, almost menacingly, that the lake had always been under strict management, that no resident had the authority to question it. And then, as if to underline the threat, she mentioned the legal actions the HOA could take, the potential fines, the penalties, and I realized that this wasn't about safety or water treatment at all. It was about control, power, and fear. I felt anger flare up inside me, but I also knew that showing too much could be dangerous. The stakes were higher than I had imagined, and I had to navigate carefully, yet determinedly. The weight of their authority pressed down, but I could see cracks, subtle gestures, nervous glances, a hesitation that hinted someone might be questioning the board's actions privately. And I decided to exploit that, asking pointed questions about testing logs, dates, chemical names, and pipelines, refusing to let their vague reassurances stand. A few neighbors whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking toward me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I realized some of them might secretly agree with me but were too afraid to speak, and that knowledge gave me a small surge of hope. After the meeting, I stayed behind to speak privately with the one board member who had seemed uneasy. a middle-aged man with a tight jaw and anxious eyes. I asked him quietly about the lake, the chemicals, the water supply, and at first he denied knowing anything, but as I pressed, his shoulders slumped, and he whispered that the president had insisted on secrecy, that the chemicals were dangerous if mishandled, that some tests had shown contamination that could have affected the water, but that revealing the full truth would have caused panic and possibly legal scrutiny. And I realized then that their plan to control the lake had already put everyone at risk. My pulse raced. As I left the meeting, realizing I was now entangled in a web far larger than myself, a battle not just for fishing or peace, but for the safety of the entire neighborhood, I returned home that evening and saw maintenance trucks leaving the lake, barrels marked only with symbols and numbers I didn't recognize, and I noticed the man from the HOA office following at a distance, watching, his presence a silent warning. I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in, that the board was aware of my investigation, that my every move was being monitored. Yet I also felt an adrenaline-fueled clarity, knowing I had to act quickly and decisively, the stakes rising with each passing hour. I began compiling all my evidence, photographs, documents, water samples, recording dates, chemical types, and suspicious activities, determined to have an airtight case should I need to involve authorities. As I worked late into the night, I heard a soft knock at my door, and when I opened it, no one was there. Only a note slipped under the threshold, handwritten, reading simply, "Stop asking questions or face consequences." A chill ran through me, and in that moment I understood fully that the HOA's obsession with control was personal, directed at me. The intruder's subtle intimidation a stark reminder that my confrontation had made me a target. I couldn't ignore it. The lake was deteriorating further, the water darker, a faint foam forming along the edges, the few remaining fish struggling, and I felt the growing pressure of responsibility, that my determination to uncover the truth had escalated the danger, not just for me, but for everyone who depended on the lake. The next day, I attempted to speak to a group of neighbors about the note, hoping to rally support, but they recoiled, shaking their heads, insisting I should leave it alone, some casting nervous glances toward the direction of the HOA office as if fearing reprisal. The isolation was suffocating, yet it steeled my resolve. I couldn't be intimidated. The threats only confirmed how high the stakes were, and as I stared out at the lake that afternoon, the sun glinting off the murky surface, I realized that this was no longer a simple fight over rules. It was a battle of courage against authority, truth against secrecy, and I knew that every move I made from this point forward would carry consequences. The tension in my chest mixed with fear and determination, and I understood fully that to save the lake, to protect the water and the neighborhood, I would have to outsmart an organization used to controlling every detail, navigate the hidden alliances, endure personal threats, and expose the dangerous reality lurking beneath the serene surface. And I vowed silently, as the wind rippled across the lake, that I would not back down, no matter what the HOA threw at me, no matter how personal the attacks became, because I now understood the stakes were bigger than any single person, and I was determined to win this fight, even if it meant facing consequences I had not yet imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time, that every day the lake remained in that toxic state, the danger was growing for everyone in the neighborhood, and I decided that half measures would no longer suffice. I began investigating the water supply itself, digging through obscure public records, technical manuals, and city planning documents, piecing together something that had never been fully explained to residents, and the more I read, the more my stomach sank. I realized with mounting horror that the lake wasn't just a private sanctuary or a decorative feature. It was integral to the community's water system. The pipelines running directly from its deepest sections feeding the neighborhood with treated water for drinking, irrigation, and everyday use, and suddenly the HOA's actions took on a terrifying new weight. Poisoning the lake to assert control wasn't just about fishing. It was a reckless gamble with the very lifeblood of the community. I felt my hands shake as I traced the routes of the supply lines on a map, imagining the water carrying chemicals to every tap, every shower, every sprinkler, and my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The sickly reeds, the dead fish, the chemical smell. All of it was part of a larger danger that could affect hundreds of people, and the realization made my chest tighten with both fear and anger. I needed proof, concrete evidence that could force action. so I began collecting water samples, photographing the lake, noting the dates, the times, and the suspicious behavior of the maintenance crews. I even recorded videos of the barrels being dumped into the water, each drop a silent threat, and as I compared my samples to safe water standards, my worst fears were confirmed. The chemicals present were highly dangerous if consumed. The contamination levels exceeded safe limits, and I knew that the HOA's negligence was not just illegal. It was criminal. I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with dread, knowing that revealing this could provoke retaliation. But I couldn't stand by and let people drink poisoned water. I contacted a local environmental inspector, hoping for guidance, and when she arrived and examined my samples, her face went pale. She whispered that the contamination was severe, that immediate intervention was required, and she hinted that the HOA could face serious consequences if this was reported publicly. I left her office shaken but resolute. The stakes had grown far beyond personal conflict. Now lives could be at risk, and I knew that confronting the HOA directly would be dangerous. Yet inaction was no longer an option. The following days were tense and exhausting. I watched as trucks arrived again, this time trying to appear routine, but I recorded everything, noting license plates, employee IDs, even the route they took to avoid drawing attention. The feeling of being constantly watched intensified. I couldn't trust anyone. And yet I realized that the more I exposed, the more the neighborhood began to sense something was wrong. I overheard whispers among residents, cautious glances, hushed conversations, and a flicker of hope ignited, that some of them might secretly support me. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, each decision carrying far-reaching consequences. I spent long nights compiling every scrap of evidence, preparing a comprehensive report, imagining the confrontation that would inevitably come, and then the breakthrough happened as I cross-referenced water flow diagrams with maintenance logs. I discovered a hidden note in a technical report, a brief annotation made by an engineer months before I moved in, warning that altering the lake's chemical balance could disrupt the water supply, that the system was fragile and dependent on the lake remaining healthy. My heart pounded as I realized the HOA must have known this, that their insistence on secrecy and control was not ignorance but willful endangerment. I felt a mixture of outrage and disbelief. The same people who were supposed to maintain safety had gambled with everyone's well-being to assert power over me. And the weight of that truth made the room spin as I read and reread the note, unable to believe how far they were willing to go. As I pieced it together, I understood the full implications. The contamination could have reached taps, showers, irrigation systems, perhaps even food grown in residence gardens. The potential for harm was enormous, and yet somehow no one had connected the dots until me. The realization was both terrifying and empowering. I knew I held the key to exposing the truth, to forcing intervention before the worst could happen. But I also knew the board would fight back, escalate, and possibly target me personally. My mind raced with strategies, the tension in my chest a tight coil of fear and determination. I walked to the lake at dusk, the sky streaked with pink and purple, and stared at the water, dark and unnerving, the reflection of the clouds rippling across the surface as if the lake itself was a warning. I thought about the neighbors, unaware of the danger, trusting the HOA, and my sense of responsibility grew heavier. The note I had found confirmed everything, that the poisoning had been deliberate, that the board understood the risk, and I realized I was no longer just a resident fighting rules. I was someone standing between the community and a potential disaster. The enormity of it pressed down on me, my pulse quickening, hands trembling slightly. As I reached out and touched the water, I felt its cold, slippery surface beneath my fingers in a surge of resolve. I couldn't let them succeed. I couldn't allow fear or intimidation to stop me, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake turning a dark, ominous shade under the fading light, I understood that everything was about to change, that the coming days would force me into confrontations that could be dangerous, that the HOA would not relent, that exposure of their actions could provoke fury, but also that I had the leverage, the knowledge, and the moral certainty to stand up and demand accountability. I returned home that night, exhausted but alert, laying out every piece of evidence, planning how to approach authorities, considering how to protect myself from retaliation. Knowing that the turning point had come, the truth was undeniable. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and that the battle for the lake, the water, and the safety of the entire community had only just begun. And as I stared out at the window at the darkening water, I felt a mixture of fear, anger, and determination, knowing that the next move I made could decide everything, that the turning point had arrived, and there was no turning back, that I knew the moment of confrontation had arrived, that I could no longer sit quietly, collect evidence, and hope someone else would act. The weight of responsibility pressed down like a physical force as I walked into the HOA office that morning. Documents and water samples clutched tightly in my hands, my pulse pounding, every step echoing in the empty corridor as if the building itself was aware of the storm I was bringing. The receptionist glanced up with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, but I ignored it, demanding to see the president immediately, and when she appeared, sharp, precise, the air around her taut with authority, I laid everything on the table: photographs of dead fish, chemical test results, maintenance logs, the hidden note proving they knew the lake's health was critical to the water supply. Her eyes flickered with a reaction I had never seen before, a brief flash of surprise, quickly masked by controlled composure. I could almost feel the tension in the room thicken, and then she began speaking, her words calm but icy, attempting to diminish the evidence, insisting that everything was under control, that the chemicals were routine, that my concerns were exaggerated. But I refused to be silenced. I countered with the annotated report from the engineer, the data from the inspector, the documentation proving that the contamination could have reached the taps of every house in the community. And I saw the mask slip, a tightness in her jaw, a brief hesitation, a flicker of panic behind the eyes she worked so hard to hide. The board members standing behind her shifted uneasily, whispering to each other, and I realized that my confrontation had unsettled them more than I had imagined. The president leaned forward, voice low, almost a hiss, warning me again about fines, legal action, and harassment, but I pushed harder, asking about the hidden risks, the barrels, the chemicals, demanding to know why they had endangered the water supply for everyone. For the control of one lake, the room grew charged, like electricity before a storm, the air thick and heavy, and then, unexpectedly, a middle-aged board member stepped forward, glancing at the president, and in a voice barely above a whisper, admitted that they had known the lake's condition could compromise the water supply, that they had underestimated the risks, and the confession hit me like a physical blow, the realization that their secrecy had been deliberate, that they had gambled with everyone's safety for the sake of authority. The president's composure faltered for the first time, the sharp lines of control wavering as she demanded the board member retract his statement. But it was too late. The truth was out. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through me as I realized the power had shifted. I was no longer alone. I had exposed the danger, forced them into a corner. Yet even as relief surged, fear coiled inside me, because I knew retaliation was still possible. As I left the office, neighbors emerging from nearby streets, eyes wide with curiosity and alarm, some whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief, the sense of urgency spreading like wildfire. I contacted the environmental authorities immediately, sharing my full report, samples, and documentation, and within hours, inspectors were arriving, testing, questioning, and documenting. The HOA scrambled to respond, issuing statements attempting to downplay the situation. But the evidence was irrefutable, the contamination clear, the risk undeniable. I felt a mix of triumph and exhaustion, knowing that I had forced accountability, yet aware that the fallout would ripple through the neighborhood for weeks. The first neighbor came to my door that evening, a young mother who had remained silent before, trembling as she thanked me for exposing the truth, saying she had feared the water, that her children drank it daily, and I realized then that my fight had been far larger than a personal struggle. It had been a responsibility to every family relying on that lake. The HOA president was temporarily removed from her position pending investigation, her expression unreadable as she packed her office, and I watched with a mixture of vindication and lingering unease, understanding that while justice was underway, the scars of secrecy and fear would remain. The community meetings that followed were tense, neighbors confronting the board, demanding transparency, and I found myself both exhausted and propelled by a sense of purpose. Knowing that I had changed the course of events, the lake itself began to show signs of recovery as the authorities intervened, removing harmful chemicals, testing and balancing the water, the first fish cautiously returning, the reeds slowly green, the water clearing, and I stood on the dock one evening, exhausted, the sunset reflecting off the surface, feeling both relief and a residual tension. Aware that the battle had been won but vigilance was still necessary, I realized that the most intense part of the story wasn't just exposing the truth. It was enduring the fear, the threats, the isolation, and emerging stronger, having faced the full force of authority and secrecy and come through unbroken. And as I watched the lake shimmer in the fading light, I understood that my courage had sparked change. The HOA would never exert the same control again. Neighbors now spoke openly, some quietly thanking me, others cautiously reconnecting with the lake, and in that moment, I felt a mixture of triumph, exhaustion, and deep emotional release, knowing that the climax had been reached, the danger addressed, and yet the memory of how close we had come to disaster would stay with me forever, a reminder of the cost of silence, the power of persistence, and the delicate balance between authority and accountability. And as I breathed in the cool evening air, the lake reflecting the pink and purple sky, I allowed myself the rare smile of relief, knowing that I had not only saved a lake but had preserved the safety and trust of an entire community, and that nothing would ever make me doubt the importance of standing up, even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked against me. The days after the confrontation were surreal, a mixture of relief, tension, and quiet triumph, as the neighborhood began to adjust to the truth. The lake, once poisoned and dangerous, slowly returned to life under the careful supervision of environmental authorities. I watched from my dock as the water cleared, the fish cautiously returning, reeds green and strong, the gentle ripples reflecting the soft sunlight, and with each passing day, a sense of healing settled over the community. The neighbors who had once avoided me now nodded in acknowledgement, some even stopping to speak, cautiously at first, sharing their own fears and gratitude, the weight of isolation lifting as I realized that my fight had not only saved the lake but also restored a sense of shared responsibility. The HOA, stripped of its unchecked power, began to operate under stricter regulations, transparency enforced, the president temporarily removed, and meetings held openly, where questions were welcomed rather than silenced. The shift in authority was palpable, a reminder that accountability could overcome fear. I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and lingering caution, knowing that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Yet the way neighbors now approached each other with curiosity and renewed engagement was encouraging. In those first few weeks, I spent more time walking along the lakeshore, not just observing the water, but reconnecting with the rhythm of the neighborhood, children tentatively returning to play by the water's edge, families cautiously fishing in sections deemed safe, the sense of community slowly rekindling. I even started conversations with neighbors who had once been hesitant or fearful, listening to their experiences, their own realizations about the HOA, and sharing what I had learned. The emotional energy of these exchanges was profound, a mixture of relief, respect, and cautious optimism. I felt bonds forming, strengthened by shared understanding and the knowledge that the threat had been real, that together, we had endured it and emerged wiser. Personally, I felt a shift within myself as well, the anxiety and fear that had consumed me in the early days of the crisis gradually gave way to a steadier confidence. I had faced authority, intimidation, and secrecy, yet I had persevered, and the victory, though exhausting, was deeply validating. It was not just about the lake or water supply. It was about standing up for truth and safety, about trusting my instincts and refusing to accept control imposed through fear. At the same time, I remained aware of the fragility of peace. The lake still needed monitoring, and the community still needed vigilance. Yet I no longer felt powerless. The experience had shown me that persistence, preparation, and courage could make a tangible difference. One afternoon, a neighbor approached me with a small note of thanks, recounting how her children had been drinking water from the lake and how terrified she had been, and her gratitude moved me more than I could express, the impact of my actions rippling quietly through the lives of those around me. I thought often of the board members who had tried to intimidate and silence me. The lessons learned were bitter, yet important, that unchecked power, secrecy, and fear can only last so long when confronted with evidence, determination, and community awareness. The HOA's fallibility had reminded everyone, including me, of the responsibility each of us has to question, to observe, and to act when safety and truth are at stake. Evenings by the lake became a time of reflection, watching the sun set over the water, the gentle lapping of waves, the occasional splash of a returning fish, and I felt a deep sense of peace mixed with awareness that tranquility is never guaranteed, but can be nurtured and defended. I also took the time to share my experiences with other residents, creating a small group focused on maintaining the lake and ensuring transparency in community decisions, empowering others to act, to question, and to prevent future crises. The process was gradual but deeply rewarding, watching people transform fear into engagement, secrecy into openness, and frustration into collective action. I realized that this experience had changed me, sharpened my instincts, strengthened my resolve, and deepened my empathy. I no longer saw myself as simply a resident, but as someone responsible not only for my own safety and peace but also for the well-being of the larger community. The lake had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting both the fragility and resilience of trust, authority, and collective responsibility. One quiet evening, sitting on my dock as the water shimmered under a soft golden light, a neighbor waved from across the shore, smiling genuinely, and I felt a profound sense of connection, a recognition that while fear had once ruled our lives, awareness, courage, and action had restored balance. I thought about how easy it would have been to stay silent, to avoid confrontation, and how much worse the consequences could have been. The memory of that fear remained, a reminder of the stakes, but it was tempered by the knowledge that intervention had prevented disaster, and I felt both pride and humility, aware that one person's determination could ripple outward to protect many. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in warm shades of pink and orange, I felt the water reflect not only the light but the journey we had all taken, a mirror of struggle, courage, and gradual restoration. I understood that the story of the lake was not just about chemicals, rules, or authority. It was about human resilience, about the power of standing up when circumstances demand it, and about the quiet satisfaction of seeing a community slowly reclaim safety, trust, and hope. The ripples on the water carrying a sense of completion but also a gentle reminder that vigilance and care are ongoing. And as I rose from the dock, inhaling the crisp evening air, I felt a deep sense of closure mixed with thoughtful reflection, knowing that life would continue with its challenges, but that through persistence, courage, and awareness, it was possible to face adversity, protect what matters, and leave a lasting, positive impact. The lake, now healthy and vibrant, mirrored not only the sunset but the change within me and the neighborhood, a testament to the quiet strength of one person willing to act, and I carried that sense of resolve and calm with me, ready to face whatever came next, confident in the knowledge that standing up for truth and safety had made all the difference. Months had passed since the confrontation with the HO, and the lake, once poisoned and fragile, now glimmered like a jewel in the sunlight, its surface clear and lively, the reeds standing tall, and the fish moving freely beneath the water. Yet the memory of those tense, fearful days remained etched in my mind, a reminder that peace is never guaranteed and that even the most serene places can conceal danger. I found myself walking along the shore more often, not just to enjoy the view or fish, but to reflect on everything that had happened, on the fear, the uncertainty, the isolation I had felt when neighbors avoided me, and on the surge of determination that had propelled me to act despite the risks. I realized how much I had grown, that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to face it, and that one person's voice, when used with persistence and care, can ripple outward to protect many. The community, too, had changed. The neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now met in the evenings by the lake, sharing stories, laughter, and careful discussions about maintenance, oversight, and safety, a cautious sense of solidarity emerging from the chaos. I had even formed a small group dedicated to monitoring the lake and ensuring transparency in community decisions, teaching and learning from each other, empowering everyone to recognize that vigilance and collective responsibility were the truest forms of security. Personally, I had discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, an inner resilience that had been tested and forged under pressure. I had learned to trust my instincts, to question authority when needed, and to act decisively when the stakes were high. Yet I also discovered the importance of patience, listening, and careful observation. That change is rarely instantaneous and often requires steady, consistent effort. There were moments of quiet joy, too, mornings when the water reflected the sunrise and I could finally breathe without the weight of dread pressing on my chest. Evenings when neighbors' children splashed in safe areas of the lake, their laughter a soft chorus of reassurance. I allowed myself to feel gratitude for the restored life of the lake, for the renewed trust among residents, and for the knowledge that I had played a role in protecting something vital for everyone. I also reflected on the HOA, understanding that while their power had been diminished, the experience had left lingering lessons about the dangers of unchecked authority, secrecy, and complacency, and I hoped that the future board members would carry those lessons forward, that no one would ever again gamble with the safety of the community for control or personal agenda. At the same time, I remained aware that vigilance would always be necessary, that peace and safety are earned and maintained rather than granted. I began documenting the entire ordeal in a journal, not just for myself but as a cautionary tale and a guide for others, describing the small signs I had initially overlooked, the subtle manipulations, the importance of observation, preparation, and timely action, hoping that anyone who faced similar situations could learn from my experience and find courage in their own convictions. There were days when I allowed myself quiet pride, thinking of the families who had unknowingly relied on the lake's health, of the children drinking safe water, of the neighbors who had regained faith in their community, and those moments were balanced with humility, knowing that the outcome had not been inevitable, that the risk had been real, and that perseverance and care had made all the difference. Over time, I noticed a change within myself that went beyond courage and determination. I had developed a deeper empathy, an awareness that individual actions matter, that choices ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict, and that standing up for what is right requires patience, strategy, and emotional strength. I began volunteering in other community initiatives, offering support and guidance, listening to concerns, and encouraging responsible action, finding that my experience with the lake had equipped me to handle challenges with clarity and compassion, and that the fear I had once felt could now be transformed into purpose. Occasionally, I would pause by the water, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the lake in warm shades of gold and purple, and feel the quiet satisfaction of having preserved something precious, of having faced adversity, of having seen the fragile balance between power, responsibility, and community restored. In those moments, I understood the deeper truth of the entire ordeal, that vigilance, courage, and persistence are inseparable from hope, that fear can be overcome, that transparency and accountability are not just ideals but lifelines, and that the choices we make, even when daunting, can protect not only ourselves but everyone around us. As I walked home along the path lined with newly green reeds, I realized that the lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a reflection of resilience, trust, and the quiet strength that arises when people refuse to look away, and I carried that lesson with me. A guiding principle for life, that standing up for what matters, even in the face of intimidation and uncertainty, can create ripples of change far beyond what we imagine. And as the last light of day shimmered across the water, I felt a profound sense of closure, peace, and enduring responsibility, knowing that the story of the lake would remain with me forever, a testament to the power of action, the importance of community, and the unshakable truth that courage, once found, can illuminate even the darkest waters.